I'm here speaking with Boyd Petersen about his newly published book, Dead Wood and Rushing Water, Essays on Mormon Faith, Culture, and Family. Thanks for joining me, Boyd.
Thanks.
I think the first thing I want to ask you about is just the general process of writing and the choice to gather all these. You didn't write it as all of these things as a single book. You wrote various essays and then decided to compile them. These essays reflect, I think, what's a unique experience, some unique experience of yours, being son-in-law of Hugh Nibley, being married to a brilliant BYU professor, being a Democrat in the reddest county in the country, and running for office as a Democrat. So you bring a lot of interesting perspective to the table. Talk about the decision to go ahead and compile this collection and what it was like for you.
Sure. Well, I started the collection when I realized that a few of the things I'd written years ago were still being read by people, and most of the comments had been positive, but I wasn't sure I still agreed with myself. And so I felt like I needed to respond in some way, but I couldn't really respond to the same essay without having the essay next to it. And so putting the collection together allowed me to be able to respond to myself in a way, so to have a dialogue, with my old self and my new self. So that was the initial idea. But also I think, taking things that you published in, some of these things were published in magazines and journals, and being able to present them to a larger audience was also a motive, to bring them to other people who, wouldn't be necessarily subscribing to a particular journal that they were originally published in. So those were I think the two main things that motivated me.
Yeah, you can kind of see this internal dialogue that you're talking about, this dialogue you're having with yourself or with your younger self, if you will. There's a particular pair of essays in here that I found especially interesting, in part because it's even today a very controversial topic. You wrote, several years ago, you wrote an essay entitled "The Priesthood, Men's Last Best Hope." And there's really no way to write something on that topic without it potentially being controversial and saying some things that aren't gonna please people. I guess part of what's interesting about this is that in some sense, when you revisit the essay more than a decade later, you're one of the people that aren't entirely pleased with it.
Yeah.
And so you write a response to yourself. So we have your essay, and then we have 15 years later a response to Priesthood, Men's Last Best Hope. So talk a little bit about that, the process of actually, in this particular essay, in this particular difficult topic, what it was like to revisit it and to sort of be in conversation with yourself and maybe debate yourself.
So actually, when I published the first essay, I was really a new father, and I think one of the things that really occurred to me and influenced that first publication was that the priesthood gave me a sense of belonging to my children, in a way that I was kind of surprised by. When I held my daughter and my son in that circle to give them a name and a blessing, that was the first time I really felt involved in their lives. It really brought me into their lives. And so that perspective influenced that essay a great deal. But 15 years later, my daughter is a grown-up, and seeing the way she had navigated the church and the problems that were there, and so that really changed my perspective, as well as living with my wife, who's a PhD and teaches at BYU, and so my perspective changed. In some ways, I still believed in the things I said earlier, but they just didn't quite add up the way they used to. And so that was my desire, is to try to respond to that particular essay in a way that reflected a different perspective in my life, a different place in my life.
So I guess part of what's so interesting about the book is that it reflects this growth, this development that you've gone through over the years, this changing perspective, and this impulse to kind of argue with yourself, to go back and revisit what you used to think. In some ways, this is kind of the worst nightmare of any academic. When you go back to what you wrote in graduate school and you sort of cringe.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of there's a kind of wisdom here in the essays that's in part reflected by comparing them all to each other and by sort of seeing how these tensions play themselves out. I think one thing I'm wondering in particular was there any specific essay in here that was especially difficult for you, or a topic that was especially challenging, or that for you to write about, or for you to come to any kind of conclusions on?
Well, I think one of the things that influenced this book, when I was a young person, I remember when Gene England's book, Dialogues with Myself, came out, and that had a huge impact on my life, not just because, it was really well written and interesting, but I saw there this soul struggling and grappling with these paradoxes and tensions in his life, and so the personal essay became something that I really took to, because I felt like it helped me understand myself. And even the biography I did of Hugh Nibley, in many ways, it's a personal essay approach. I still approached it from my perspective, and so in many ways the personal essay is not it's something I've kind of become accustomed to. I think one of the issues that's been hard to do in the book, but I've had a lot of people respond to it, is dealing with issues of depression. I've suffered with depression most of my life, and talking about that openly, it wasn't especially easy to do. But I found that by doing that, I've had a lot of people who've come to me and said, that's something I've dealt with too, and it's made a big difference in my life to just know that there's somebody else out there who's having the same challenges. So that's one of the things I think that the personal essay does, is help us kind of come into the world of the author, and obviously my world's different than other people's worlds, but I think the beauty of the personal essay is that you get this perspective, but there are universals that we all deal with in our own ways, and so yeah, I think that's one of the things that really challenged me was just trying to be honest.
So there were two things that you just said in that response that, in my mind, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit with a comparison maybe, but in my mind really did invoke Gene England. One is that he was sort of the master of this genre of the personal essay, and of making the personal essay speak to people, speak to Mormon audience, speak to people from different perspectives, and really touch people. I mean, I remember myself, the first time I encountered, I think it was the first paperback of his I picked up was Why the Church is as True as the Gospel, but then I went and I found these other volumes, these other collections of his essays, and it really had a profound impact on me. The other thing, that, besides the personal essay, the other thing that strongly, I think, invokes his kind of legacy is there's a kind of vulnerability, right, to his writing. He sort of lays himself out there and opens himself up to criticism, but the way he makes himself vulnerable to the reader and is willing to kind of open up certain things that we're not always comfortable opening up about ourselves to the reader. And so in that sense, I think this book is very much, in fact, maybe more so than anything that's been published since his death, really reminds me of Gene England's his style, and I think it sort of fits in his legacy.
Well, like I said, he had a huge impact on my life. When we first were married, he was our bishop, and he was a teacher. He was somebody. He's one of these bishops. I've never had one since, so I don't know why I say one of these, because he was the only one I've ever had who he would speak each week. He got to know each person individually, and that sense of vulnerability in his essays was there in his life as well. And so I really looked up to him in many ways. So I dedicated the book to him for that reason, because he was such a mentor in my own life.
Well, it's a fitting dedication. It's a great book. Thanks for talking to me today, Boyd.
Thank you.